Hello everyone, today we talk about the military and provincial reorganization of the Roman Empire in Augustan times. So this is a big topic because it involves a great deal how Rome began to restructure its political and military base after the civil wars, after this great moment of trouble, of transformation that allowed effectively a Roman monarchy de facto to appear, right? Because even though the Principatus is naturally a kind of ideally republican form, just with a princeps, so a primus inter pares, theoretically speaking, still what is triggered with the ascent of Octavian and his appointment to, Augustus, in fact, is really interpretable also as a product of the destructions that had occurred during the civil wars, right? The same justification for Augustan power was fundamentally laid on this great pacification of the empire that Octavian had propagandated for himself to have accomplished. Naturally, it's a bit more complicated because it has to do, like, the civil wars weren't just the ones he fought against the Caesarides. There had been, in fact, the previous civil wars between Caesar and Pompey. Then, of course, there was the war of the second triumvirate that, Octavian was. He was, first of all, let's say immediately that I deem Augustus to be the single greatest politician in world history. Like, I have all the greatest admiration, respect. I'm very keen on him, and I really like him, right? Even if you will say, well, he was a snake. Yeah, he definitely was, and that's why he is my favorite snake. So this is just to approach history in general, not much about like a moral judgment like many people like to do, but objectively looking at the capabilities of these individuals and understanding what they did, also because they effectively changed the history of the world, right? Octavian changed Roman history, right? Even if he was the adoptive son of Caesar, and he, even during the war of the second triumvirate, he built up like a figure of Mark Antony, his rival, as a kind of a oriental ruler that had betrayed the Roman more. Actually, he was like Antony was way more, he was a true Caesarian, we can say. Well, Octavian was not. Octavian is another generation, but he's also a different mind, and a greater mind in many ways. Augustus set a system that would last fundamentally for 300 years, and you can even consider, the accomplishments of the Roman Empire in general, from his time onwards, to have remained till the very end. The name of Augustus, as well as Caesar, of course, was maintained in the official denomination, imperial denomination. I mean, it was a symbol. It was Augustus was deified, right? So naturally, it's very easy sometimes to to separate very sharply certain phases of Roman history and say, here things began. But actually, what is fascinating about the Roman Empire are, of course, the transformations, the changes, but also the continuities at the same time. Like in a fluid succession of events that, however, bore in mind certain aspects that we are generally prone to forget or to overlook. For example, I recently insisted very much on the religious foundation of the Roman Empire. That is what we have basically not necessarily denied, but completely forgotten on some occasions. I made several videos about this, about the Roman Aquila, also about the official religion of the Roman army just recently, trying to make you understand what for these people really meant, right? Of course, we can't know what was in the mindset of an ancient Roman 2,000 years ago, but all we know about that world shows us, telling the truth pretty openly and pretty eloquently and explicitly, what that mindset was about, with also the same foundation and legitimization of certain institutions, like the Principatus in itself represents. By the way, as always, there should be like usual for my regular followers, but I always speak generally, especially in this ancient phase, like in what we think it's the so-called classical pronunciation, right? So if I sound weird because you're used to the ecclesiastical one, yeah, that's what I'm using, and it's not a problem telling the truth, because it's still somewhat debated what those sounds were like, because ultimately we have no recorder, we don't know how they actually spoke, but we think their phonetics, like for overwhelming majority, let's say, was like this. So important topics, we could spend countless hours discussing this as a premise, but let's get into the matter here. So this is the end of the civil wars with Battle Actium 32 BC. Octavian gets rid of his rivals, effectively of Antony and Cleopatra, and the empire is fundamentally reunified. Right, you know that the triumvirate had entailed this repetition of the empire in different different parts, and Octavian reunites them at the end of a long period of civil wars that had engulfed the whole Roman res publica, which was, telling you the truth, res publica populi Romani is the official name of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire wasn't conceived like, in fact, the Romanum Imperium, right? It was the common thing of the Roman people that, of course, could entail also the imperium in the measure in which the deity conferred it to victorious generals. But that's conceptually the thing, because while very inclusive towards foreigners, the Romans also had conceptually kind of an exclusive idea of what Romanity was. Like, Romanity was the elected, the divinely elected element, right? The Romans truly believed they were a chosen people by the deity, or deities if you prefer in this sense, but there is a hierarchy also in this that does not have to be equivocated. So the Romans had in their mind their mission to conquer the world, and this was objectively achieved in the first centuries of the early empire, because, as I often say, it doesn't matter that there was a globe out there, but for what was the known world at the time, the Romans conquered, right? Because even if they had contacts with China, whatever, their sphere, their mindset was focused on the Mediterranean and Europe, and that's the idea. So the concept here is this moment of peace. In fact, the very famous Pax Romana, intended as not just as peace in the sense of the absence of war and destruction, but in fact the true prosperity, right? A divine gift of the winners, right? The reward. And Octavian had assumed this princely status in at least if Buddhists assume it, in as a restorer of the ancient order, right? If the Romans are a chosen people of the divinity, why would they turn against each other and destroy the res publica in the wars? And the reason that Octavian had given is that basically at one point the ancient Sibylline books had been desecrated, and that therefore the world had gone upside down, right? And Octavian had been the one that, through the divine auspicia actually, had restored the unity of the Roman world and pacified it. And this naturally had happened through the Imperium, right? We will look at this better in detail when talking about Crassus and the Spolia Opime, that is quite meaningful in that sense. So Octavian had reassumed the imperial faculty, the imperial power in himself, like as a medium between the Romans and like the deity and the Romans. And so This is a very complex concept we're not discussing in detail today. But there is in his Res Gestae, there is much of this, and maybe one day we will look at it in detail. But the important thing here is rather to understand how this had allowed Octavian formally to assume his Augustan power, and how and that this had been possible, of course, through this moment of real political and social crisis, for which that generally, historically speaking, tends to centralize society at one point. And this had happened towards monarchical direction. Obviously, for the Romans, the monarchy at this time in history was inconceivable, right? It will never be like at the time of the Dominatus, already further ahead into the Byzantine period. The concept here is that the Romans, especially in Italy, in Rome proper, and in the West, generally speaking, have this pretty clear kind of still a republican/democratic view of power, right? The idea that fundamentally all Romans are freemen, right? They're part of this chosen stock, right? There is a kind of an ethnic ideal attached to it, even if the Romans were, born as, of course, as a mix of different peoples, like the Latins, the Sabines, partly the Etruscan, even some Greek. But the point in this is that, and this is naturally a talk about elites, right? It's very complicated now to address all the difference between the patricians and the plebeians in this broader, not just institutional, but properly religious background, because that's what I was talking to you about before. But let's say that, to make a long story short, the Romans had loathed the idea of a king, right? But the Republic as such had progressively deteriorated. It had been entered in necrosis since the time of Sulla, that had paradoxically tried to restore the ancient order, but it was factually something different. By fundamentally the 53 BC, when Pompey's troops have to march in Rome, that it's the moment in which the Senate admittedly doesn't have any control whatsoever on the Republic, but right, and it's about all these warlords of the first triumvirate in that case, and therefore that's the moment in which the Republic is dead, right? And the civil wars are just this major upheaval that Octavian was drastic and radical, and sometimes you can't even use the term revolutionary, but with a certain circumspection. It's always about the term, which is very misused most of the time in a sensationalistic way. But objectively, Octavian really changed a great deal. I mean, even Caesar, in his formula, he had seen through right a lot of things, telling the truth, but he probably Caesarianism was not a solution, and that's in fact how basically the second civil war had started. But also it had not been drastic enough. It had not inserted anything specifically different, right? Will really change about the Republic in itself. Will really changes the whole institutional profile is Octavian, right? So the term Pax Romana is, from one side, well deserved to Augustan times, that also are 40 years of rule. No Roman emperor will ever achieve anything like that. Even the other longest ones will rule for like 20 years. I think the second was Antoninus Pius. The second, another was Tiberius, Augustus' successor. But the average reign of the Roman emperors was pretty short. This was a problem, probably the only major fault of the Augustan system as it was triggered, that otherwise worked pretty well. This problem of succession, right? Today we will see also the problems that also in Augustus' reign, empire, to say better, at this point, were emerging because of the problem of succession. Augustus didn't actually have male sons. He had male grandsons, to tell the truth, but they died. He had his adoptive son at the end, Tiberius, that was not believed at the beginning to have succeeded to the throne, but so it happened fundamentally. This happened technically still by election by the Roman Senate, that obviously participated to the Augustan institutional system. Octavian in this was very clever to, of course, draw a pretty sharp and clear line between the princeps and the senatus, but at the same time he couldn't reign without the elite, without the senators. That, Rome had always been an oligarchy. Rome was never a democracy, practically speaking. The people did participate with his own comitia, whatever, but it was always an oligarchy, and it's always this aristocracy at the end of the day that ruled the business. So we will see, in fact, especially in the provincial resystematization of the empire, how much space was given to senators who had provinces dedicated to them that they could administrate on their own. And Augustus was very clever to balance everything out. Like, from one side, he favored the middle classes, were also very important for the expansion of the empire in that moment, and stressing also in part the extension of citizenship, and this general integration was the sap of the same Roman fitness as an empire. And from the other side, he tried to content, in fact, also the senators in their luxus and their mindset, their privileges, etc. So at one point, the other members of the Julio-Claudian dynasty will try to instead favor much more the middle classes. I believe personally that every single member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty was actually a freaking damn good emperor, contrarily-wise to what people believe, like that Caligula was crazy or that Nero was just a depraved, weird, though, and whatever. Actually, that's Flavian propaganda most of the times, and we have to look at them in a very objective fashion. Nero enacted this monetary reform that would remain intact and functional up for 2 centuries and a half, right? Caligula was not the crazy person. He actually was much more. He was very clever, first of all. But this is not to say that what historians write also about, I don't know, for example, his illness at one point is not true. But the whole thing has to be observed into a kind of a critical way, which is normally what Roman history in the academies is taught, like not actually taking history is not taking literally what historians wrote, right, and pretending that's history. I don't think this has ever been a thing actually since the scientific mind in history prevails. As a method. So, but the Pax Romana is also misleading sometimes, because it was a propagandistic term as well. Actually, the Augustan Empire was pretty violent. Like, Augustus even was away from Rome for entire years. He stayed like 2 or 3 years in Gaul to counter Germanic invasions. There were so many wars that today we won't be looking at in detail, because it's not what we're discussing. But think about in Cantabria, on the Rhine border, in Pannonia, the Great Illyrian Revolt, the problems in Armenia, and those were the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. So these were actually. The Romans fought a lot of wars during Augustan times. It was not a peaceful time as such. It was just, however, a time of peace for the majority of the empire after these decades of continuous civil wars that had really exhausted the empire. Millions of Roman citizens had been in arms during that period. So that was a big problem that also bore in itself many problems further that had yet to be settled when the war against Antony was over, right? And a great help in this sense was the annexation of Egypt that occurred in 30 BC, formally at least, that allowed Rome to dispose of enormous resources, right? The Nile Valley and also the trade routes that are an enormous asset that the Romans put their hands on when they conquer Egypt, right? And in the early empire, Egypt in fact became the second supplier of grain, preceded only by Africa, meant as Roman Africa. That is fundamentally today's Tunisia, roughly, in eastern Algeria. And other regions, even Sicily, partly even Sardinia, were being close to Rome. They supported. A big problem at this point was keeping the Roman mob happy, well fed. Rome had been a difficult city to handle even during the second triumvirate, and in order, especially for economical reasons, in terms of resources, Octavian at one point had to starve entire African regions to bring grain to Rome, since Egypt was controlled by Mark Antony, and so on. So at this point, the Romans literally have the greatest amount of wealth that any other power had ever had at the time. Not even Alexander's empire had been anything like that. And in terms of sheer economical resources, this was a giant, right? And in order not to run further risks, because when you conquer a province, you also have to be very careful how you manage that. Octavian, still Octavian at that point, not Augustus yet, organized Egypt in this particular condition of a province that was to his own direct dependence. Right, Egypt was administered by a praefectus of equestrian rank. This was very important because these were people who were generally more loyal to the emperor for the sake of career. They depended on him, and there was this direct control. So Egypt, in this systematization, was a very special province on its own, because of grain assets, because of also the general wealth that could also be levied from there. There were a lot of people living there, and telling the truth, it was also fairly easy to maintain, right? As we will see, eventually just 2 legions were enough, because essentially in Egypt, once you control this stripe of the Nile Valley, the rest is desert. You don't have to worry very much. But in the desert, where also other populations maybe can be nasty, there was, for example, the kingdom of Meroe. At one point, that when Antony was destroyed, they tried to invade Egypt, and Augustus said halt. They sent their legions there, and they say okay, fine. And in fact, Meroe, this Ethiopian Sudanese entity, that was kind of advanced because it was kind of close to Arabia, to Yemen, and to Egypt, so it was kind of civilized. It was an important. It would become a partner at one point of the empire, because essentially the empire also controlled, there was no reason to be enemy of the empire at that point. The traffics from Black Africa roughly passed through there. They could export it to Arabia, to the Mediterranean. The Romans, after all controlled also the rest of the North African coast, so there weren't many other. It was such an enormous power that even many other smaller entities didn't quite have any interest to go against it at that point. So, more importantly, senators couldn't go in Egypt without preventive authorization from the side of the princeps. Right. This is also very important because the senators obviously were much into business, as you can imagine. Usually, it was the equestrians that are represented as the dealers, those who got their hands a bit more dirty. Also, with there's it was a pretty corrupted world, like all the world was at that time, with for concussions, corruption, and things like that. This various contracts that were privately done in the administration of the provinces, because basically the Republic had administered this Mediterranean land. I mean, not Egypt yet, but other regions, especially the western coast of Asia Minor, was a very wealthy, same Greece, but also southern Spain, in kind of a private fashion, right? The empire had not formally institutionalized it. It had, in the last centuries of the Republic, it had evolved in a kind of a private direction, as we've seen, especially towards the second half of the second century, and but even, let's say, the second century and first BC. So that had also triggered bad government, rebellions. Part of the crisis of the Republic had also come from the Fader organizing this. And many people say it began from the Second Punic War onwards, especially even the slaughter of Cannae killed so many of the older families that also had a kind of more commitment, more sense of themselves, and there was a new wave of aristocracy that was more interested in money than in kind of a more functional a better functionment of the institutions. Let's say it's kind of debatable now. Maybe we'll study that period more in detail. But the important thing here is that, okay, Egypt is a province where senators cannot step. This is also important to understand the power that the princeps had assumed at this point, right? So senators can go there, but just if Augustus says they can. The treasures of Cleopatra also had furnished the means, very important means, to liquidate in a satisfactory way many of the too many soldiers that were all around in the empire. It was a big deal. The civil wars had brought so many people under arms, so many legions had been levied. Most of them were under strength, doesn't matter, but they were kind of entities on their own that had their own military strength, their own interests, and especially these legionaries wanted to get paid, right? These were some of the legionaries in Roman history that objectively had worked the most, we can say, that had risked the most. Actually, from this time onwards, for a long time, the legionary life wouldn't be very risky at all. I mean, the chances of being a legionary, a Roman citizen, soldier, and getting killed in action, these first centuries of the empire will be very, very low. Like, most of the job was done by the Auxiliaries. Those were the ones would. So they kind of had it easier. But all these other veterans now were waiting for their money, especially also for their land. So all the Ptolemaic treasure was used to pay them. In part, however, there was this mean that Caesar especially had revived a lot in several areas of the empire to found new colonies. Augustus would do it a bit everywhere, like 21 new cities in the same only in Italy. Right, founding a colony meant simply to give land to these veterans, to say, okay, you have the right now to found a city with its own rights, etc., and that was the reward, the mean of payment, especially in a moment. At this point, Augustus has also a lot of riches, in fact, a lot of cash, right? But especially towards the end of the Republic, the average mean of payment had been land, plots of land, right? As long as Rome, this could happen in many ways, chiefly about slaughtering someone else that inhabited them before, or maybe during civil wars, naturally confiscating territory that had belonged to enemy clientels and so on, because many of those owners had died. Right, the same Octavian, together with Antony, after the peace following the Battle of Mutina, they basically knocked out some of the wealthiest senators of Rome, just especially for Octavian, not because they were enemies, but simply because they were rich, and at that point the two the two allies, let's say they duumvirate at that point, wanted to cash fast. So Octavian was that's the crude reality of politics, and it's not a matter of being evil. Like, it's a matter also that there are not many options with the Caesarians that are there. They're preparing their legions to take out the entire. They have taken over most regions of the east, and they're expanding further. And you need money because you need to pay these troops in a way or in another. So. There was really a big deal, and these legionaries were too many. So Augustus manages to reduce the number of legions that had reached up to 60, roughly, thanks to the continuous enlistments for civil war. And legions are reduced, in fact, to 28, for a total of about 150,000 men. They were generally italics at this point, or drawn, however, from the most Romanized provinces, from the Roman colonies of the previous that had been founded roughly during the last century. And for all of these legionnaires, there were as much auxiliaries. I made some videos about them, so we won't stop explaining. But these were basically ordered either in cohorts of infantry or wings of cavalry. There were also the cohortes equitata that were kind of a mix of the two things. But the most important thing about the auxiliaries is that these were non-Roman citizens. It were foreigners who were enlisting in the Roman army for achieving citizenship at the end of the service. And their use was very effective. Rome, this was not a novelty. Many people think, Augustus established. No, Augustus basically, Augustus understood a lot about the military, first of all. He is usually and correctly depicted as not a particularly vigorous or, let's say, capable commander on the field. He was usually sick. He didn't have a very strong health. Yet he lived for a very long time. So, and it was mostly about Agrippa, his friend of childhood and life companion, say, of adventures of all civil wars. It was an extraordinary man. He will intermarry. Agrippa will marry famously Augustus' daughter, Julia, and he was an extraordinary individual. He was a military commander, very successful one, an architect. He was extremely competent about a lot of things, and he embellished Rome. And however, Augustus was extremely competent about military affairs. He actually even wrote a tactics treatise that unfortunately is lost. And he reorganized the Roman military that up to that point had been fundamentally not just, let's say, the transition is a bit different to say here, because what Augustus does is that he renders Roman military units permanent, right? The Roman army becomes a standing army, which even after the Marian reform wasn't the case. Well, after the Marian reform, that was mostly about the eliminating the classes of recruitment, so for which basically every single Roman citizen, independently of his wealth, personal properties, could join the army, right? Also because the state begins basically to pay the soldier, even if theoretically, he was still the soldiers, had to pay for his own equipment. Technically, still at this time, there were certain detractions for the equipment to the soldier, because the idea is that if you're a Roman citizen, it's a honor, a privilege to participate to the army. This is the ancient warrior mindset that was, but now reality had changed quite a lot, and these transformations. But objectively, after the Marian reform, doesn't matter about the uniformation, about the general, the fact that Rome by that time was still holding de facto permanent military units a bit scattered everywhere. Rome had always kind of no less than kind of 8 legions scattered everywhere in Mediterranean. But they weren't quite permanent bodies, right? They were often disbanded. This was a problem. It was a problem for the career of the NCOs that was regulated under Caesar, in fact formalized now under Augustus, especially the centurions that during the civil wars had been so relevant. And so Augustus has a lot of these troops in arms, and what he does, he decides, no, okay, let's not disband them like it was used to do before, but let's render these units permanent, right? And part of these units was already permanent by itself, like many of these legions had been levied maybe, from a very recent times. Others would be, however, very old, let's say, that they had a history, a continuity, their own administration. I mean, the legion was a complex thing. It wasn't just a bunch of men. There was all an office inside of it. There was a esprit de corps, of course, but it was also a religious thing. I mean, a legion now was acquiring kind of an identity on its own, a name, a number, a symbol, right? It was a big deal. It had always been like that, but now, after this continuity of war, now the legion symbolized something deeper, right? After all, these were the legions that had made the reconstitution of the Roman Empire possible. So now I don't want to speculate excessively, but there was an importance attached to them. There is this idea of sanctioning a state of being of matters that Augustus deeply feels as the sacred thing to do in some way. And talking about the Auxilia, also the Auxiliaries were regularized, they became permanent units that had specific operational tasks that were basically conforming to the specializations of each contingent who was enrolled in the provinces of more recent acquisition, right? So these were usually when they were recruited, these troops were still fighting in their traditional national customs, right? They were literally barbarians in looking at it. Progressively, they would Romanize themselves, so that you can find these auxiliary units even surviving as detachments for centuries. At that point, they don't have basically anything of the ancient ethnical tradition, but they were fully Romanized, right? And there is also this idea that the auxiliary troops were kind of different from the legionaries in training and equipment. It's not surely like that. I mean, tendentially, yes, the legions were the kind of heavy infantry. They had all a specific, also, sometimes even artillery attached. They were kind of a heavy thing that in fact was employed usually only in pitched battles, in sieges when they had to storm an enemy in position with this heavy assault, kind of heavy troops. But the auxiliaries would, as we were saying before, carry out the majority of the rest of the operations. And if this meant that the legionaries had just to remain there and sit in docks waiting for these guys to finish, why they could be easily kept. The auxiliary could be easily kept with legionary armament. We actually know it happened. So this dogmatic distinctions, no, the auxilia were armed like that, legionaries, no, it doesn't exist. And many of them were presumably as skilled as the legionaries, except being foreigners, having less importance as in terms of status. Let's be honest about it. We know relatively less about them. But it's still important that their sanction is there, right? And don't think that Augustus created this, because the auxilia had always been there. I mean, there's never been a single moment in this Roman Republic and imperial history in which the Roman army had more citizen troops than foreign troops. The Roman army has always had actually more foreign troops than citizen troops, always. So this is just something to remind. to those who say, well, the Roman Empire fell at one point because the barbarians took over the army. No, it had always been like that, and actually what the Roman army has kept doing at all times successfully, as long as there was a state that functioned, was a perfect Romanizer of the barbarians. So the Roman army never actually got barbarized. It's the barbarians who got Romanized by the Roman army, which is a very different concept at all times in history. And don't talk to me about the Federati, because the Federati are another thing. The Federati of the late Roman Empire we're talking about, because also at this point these were called Federati sometimes. These foreign troops were hired with in different ways, right? Sometimes there were foreign aids, right? But when you talk about, I don't know, the 5th century, well, thanks my eyes, at that point that was not the Roman army proper. Those were sovereign peoples that were maybe on Roman territory on their own, but they sent their own troops as autonomous political entities. That wasn't Roman army. It's just that the Roman state doesn't have enough wealth anymore to equip enough legionaries on their own. That's a completely different story, but those are not Roman army. So the Roman army never got barbarized. Trust me now. And trust historiography at this point in history, not me fideistically. This was a way, naturally, through the Auxilia passes all the Romanization of the provinces of these peoples that join the army and get the citizenship, and they get Romanized, they settle into Roman land, etc. They receive, in fact, land at the end of the service, as we will see now. And that's the way through which Rome keeps expanding functionally, right? Through this extension of citizenship for two people that have all the interest to work well under Rome, because therefore they can benefit from it as well. So this is an entirely successful formula, up to one point in which the empire kind of overstretched for the same, capacities of territorial control what an ancient power, technologically speaking, could do, right? Obviously, it's not about technology, it's about demographics, about economy and whatever, but it's not really a wrong formula to have extended citizenship in this sense, because it's that how literally the Roman Empire happened. If the Romans hadn't extended their citizenship, they would have not come out of Latium, right? So that's the Roman Empire. The rest is just amenities. So talking about the military service, this became not anymore like a conscription, like an imposed levy on the population, but a professional one, right? So there were the legionaries as well as the auxiliaries were fundamentally volunteers. This is very important because it will last for a very long time. Of course, in case of necessity, especially in the most troubled provinces, some troops could be conscripted forcibly, but it was an emergential situation. At the core of the Roman military is these legions and the auxilia point. The rest, there are all volunteers. The rest is just there were even local militias, like all the various communities that the empire had subjugated didn't quite lose. Think about the Hellenic polis. They still had their own military. Like they were militia, that they weren't good for campaign. They could just support with numbers and lighter troops, but they still worked, because technically speaking, there was always someone in arms and that could give a bit of help. And goes without saying that, in fact, the outer regions that were mostly the most warlike ones, the most tribal ones, because essentially the empire is extending now towards not civilization, towards lands that have to be, let's say, civilized, very Roman to say, but that's exactly the point. Rome had up to that point expanded fundamentally into those regions of the Mediterranean that were already civilized, right? Now he starts getting into the hinterland, to Central Europe, in some even other areas, like even in Asia, that they're more mountainous, tribal kind of, and these areas, once they're subjugated, they can provide these tougher troops that generally these are poorer areas. So even the promise of Romanization is quite a big attraction, right? And always remember that certain areas of the empire would also remain superficially Romanized. Think about Illyria, that now we will see revolting, but if you consider the crisis of the 3rd century, now most of the troops of the empire came from there, largely at least in the area. Why? Because those had remained fundamentally still wild territories. They inhabited by peoples that still could, like shepherds, that could were still to be opened to civilization in this sense. Well, the rest of the empire, starting from Italy, had gentrified. Had, as it always happens, when you stop being hungry, you stop also wanting to risk your life for when someone can do it in your own stead. But this change here was a big deal. The volunteers, right? And so the military service was regulated with great attention, especially towards these towards the organization of personnel, and especially the career centurions, that we mentioned before. So the centurions were particularly important, were basically the top NCOs of the Roman legion. Up to then there were other figures that came not from the ranks, but from society, fundamentally as a matter of status. There were the actual officers, and centurions were really the best soldiers around. I mean, they were every. Now it's complicated how the various promotion occurred. Like I will make a video about this surely. But let's say they literally rose through the ranks, and they were simply the best soldiers who knew how things had to be done, who had this talent for commanding other men and inspiring them and being an example. Extremely tough individuals that inspired the rest of the troop. Every soldier received a regular stipendium, right? So a salary for the duration of the service. That consisted in 20 years for the Legionaries and 24/25 for the Auxilia. The draft of the Praetorians was shorter. The Praetorians were this chosen nucleus of 9 cohorts that constituted the imperial bodyguard. The Praetorians were dislocated at this point all over the Italic territory. It's just Augustus' successors that preferred to concentrate it towards, in the just outside the capital, say better, in the Castra Praetoria. And the Praetorians, at the orders of 2 Praetorian prefects since 2 BC, constituted, in fact, an elite corps, composed exclusively by Italics that were also better paid in order to win their loyalty, and that were discharged after only 16 years of service, right? A service that was basically free of most of fatigues and perils, etc. Nevertheless, these were chosen individuals. Like, they were chosen among the best, the best troops. There were also other, even more elitary corps, like the Equites Singulares, for example, that also had to have particular engineering education, that they had to be kind of very... those were the toughest guys. And it all starts now. Actually, a few people know that the Praetorians technically existed since a very long time, since centuries before Augustus. Their formalization only occurred precisely under Tiberius, if I'm not wrong. And the point here is that, I mean, there were many units that eventually already existed that were formalized in some way, that also changed their role, that however get institutionalized in this big political and military frame that Octavian gives to the empire. At the moment of the leave, every soldier, the leave was known usually as honesta missio, which means the kind of honest leave. There were other types that were, being discharged with dishonor, for example. It still exists, of course. But usually the honesta missio entailed that every soldier received either a plot of land in the area of service, of the service they had performed at the borders of the empire, or a wad at a bit of money as a liquidation, like a kind of a severance pay, we can't say, thanks to which making a home. Also because in the army was enforced the prohibition of marrying, right? Even though this basically happened, especially when Augustus deploys, as we will see now, the legions in a stationary position along the borders. So at that point, basically, there were legions that didn't change place for centuries. So these were stationed there, and obviously, if you were there, you would kind of find kind of a girl there, and even if legally you couldn't be married, but we know that happened. And in fact, this thing stopped at the time of Septimius Severus, when we know that actually legionnaires lived with their wives inside the barracks, right? Or at least the wives visited them often, right? Or sometimes some troops were already married, because I remember of some letters, but I mean, of course, maybe those were of officials. Well, whatever. I'm just thinking on my own. But the point is that this was the reward for the service, right? So aside from the salary, it was this final compensation that allowed them to start maybe a new activity, a new business, and that was fair enough. And consider that most legionnaires would be hired pretty young, right? So even if life wasn't extraordinarily long, but still after 20 years they could still be in their late 30s, early 40s, right? And having some other decade to leave, right? Also because objectively, sometimes we think that life expectation is indicative of how the average person who came to be an adult lived, right? But that includes very often child mortality. So if you take out child mortality, it was pretty high, like 1 out of 3. If you reached your adult age, where chances were that you could arrive relatively easily up to your 60s or your 70s. So it wasn't so disastrous, telling you the truth. Augustan times weren't the best times either to be a Roman, telling you the truth. That would happen under the Antonines. I mean, in terms of individual wealth, life expectancy, literacy, but still Augustan times were fairly good in spite of all, even if they were rough times objectively. Still, in order to reward all these veterans, was even established a treasury in 6 AD, known as the Aerarium Militare, right? So the military aerarium, that was fueled by the profits coming from 2 new taxes. One was the so-called centesima rerum venalium, that was basically this, in fact, 1%, because that's what it means, deriving from auction sales. And the other one, known as vicesima hereditatium, at this point in classical pronunciation, it was this tax of 5% on inheritance, right? It's not a few for the time, right? Taxation in the ancient world was much lower than what we are used to, but still was pretty hard. I mean, considering what the growth rate of the times was. So it's not it was not a few, and life conditions, etc., per capita wealth. So aside from the Praetorian cohorts and also the one of the Vigiles and the urban ones, all the other troops were stationed in the provinces with great concentration of forces along the borders that were more exposed to possible external attacks, right? So what happened in 27 BC is that there had been a first partition of how provinces were destined for, in this sense. There were 10 Pacatai provinces that were technically, it means pacified provinces, that were held by governors sent by the Senate with a proconsular imperium, right? So they had basically a military power, but it wasn't, they weren't particularly troublesome areas. So this imperium was enough just to maintain the local populations there in case using force, but not as not with major commitment of forces, right? And these governors were usually sorted among the ex-praetors, except for the provinces of Asia and Africa, that at the time the latter comprehending also the Numidia, that were up to 2 older consulars, right? The reason is that Asia and Africa were some of the most important Roman provinces in absolute terms. They were some of the most intensely Romanized. They were some of the wealthiest and the richest, right? Asia was this western Anatolian region that was intensely Hellenized, had lots of cities, very rich, especially along the coasts, because the hinterland was all remained fundamentally not particularly developed. This remained like for a long time, like even the Middle Ages, and the Romans like had made already a lot of money there. There were lots of interest, a lot of clientele, senators, etc. Africa was kind of like that too, but especially was for food, like for supplies, for grain supplies for Rome, etc. So these were provinces that required the two older consular figures. So was the most important ones, and for this reason, such provinces are conventionally named as senatorial provinces, even if philologically speaking it would be more correct to talk about the provinces of the Roman people, right? Because it's as if they had been managed by the Roman magistracies and not by this emergential, in pacified areas fundamentally that could be civilly held, right? The other 8 of these were Baetica in southern Iberia, Sardinia and Corsica, they were all one, Sicilia, Illyricum, Macedonia, Achaia, Bithynia and Pontus, they were together, and Cyrenaica and Crete were also all together. And in spite Augustus was not a very great fighter personally, and he managed, as we recalled before, to get ill every time in the battlefields. His contribution and the one of his own generals to the expansion of empire was really enormous, right? Already before Actium, in the years 35-33 BC, he had already launched and led actually strenuous military expedition into Illyria and Dalmatia to secure the rather precarious borders of northeastern Italy. Importantly enough, in 29 BC, the demand for carrying out triumph and also the ceremony of the Spoliae Opimi from the side of Licinius Crassus, governor of Macedon, that had killed in singular duel the king of the Bastarnae, Deltas, invader of the Balkans, gave the opportunity to Augustus to fix another canonic principle. Why was this important? Well, because since the generals now were lieutenant of the Imperator, they operated and took the auspicia in his own name, and therefore only to him belonged the honors for victory. So only by his discretion, at his discretion, the victorious subalterns could be conferred the triumphal insignia, but nothing more, because the Imperator now was only one. Now this is very, very important. Like the whole deal of this story is very meaningful. So let's be honest about it. What were these Spoliae Opimi, right? Basically, they were were an ancient form of Roman human sacrifice, if you want. It would not truly quite like that, but basically these Spoliae Opimi were considered originally the corpse, eventually just the arms, of the killed enemy generals, right? They were killed by an individual Roman commander. That was the deal, right? So he who held the Imperium that killed in single combat an enemy commander. So in all Roman history, the Spoliae Opimi were conferred in 3 episodes, right? The first one, it was Romulus. The second one in 5th century BC, if I'm not wrong. Now, this Licinius Crassus, that actually was nephew to the Licinius Crassus, the one killed at Carrhae, had killed this Bastarnae chieftain, right, by his own hand. So technically, he asked for this privilege of actually carrying the Spoliae Opimi, right, literally to the temple of Jupiter, and to render this sacrifice, right? So Augustus at this time shows and proves the centralization of his power. Now the Imperium was literally the base of the Roman Empire, right? This idea of this faculty of waging arms and winning, right, was the same idea of the empire in itself. This Imperium had been somewhat controlled in Republican times by the Roman people, right? So by the senators, actually, that appointed the various Roman magistrates that could have this faculty. Now the thing changes, because it's Augustus himself that decides this. But more than that, it's not just an arbitrary power incarnated in one person. It's more than that, because basically now it's the same Imperator, the same Princeps, right, as Imperator, that owns the Imperium at all times, or better, he is the one that through the religious auspicia, right, is conferred with the faculty of conferring the Imperium by the same gods. That's very important, right? And that's the same reason why Octavian had managed to make himself Augustus at this point. Because having he been the one that through the Imperium had won the civil wars and restored the unity of the empire that had been broken because the deities of Rome had been profaned, desecrated. Well, now he disposed on their own behalf of the Imperium, and that's what the Princeps is. That's the deal here, right? And it's a big thing, and you can imagine how disconcerting this might have sounded, because this is not just about having, I don't know, more power concentrated into a single magistracy, right? This is much more. This is having the faculty of command of the whole empire incarnated into this figure more than magistrature, because the Princeps technically is not a magistrature. Augustus was many things. He was Pontifex Maximus. He had collected the sum of magistracies, but at the same time that those still belonged into the natural cycle of the natural turns of the Roman magistracies, how did they work, how they were chosen by the people, by the Senate. These appointments kind of worked more or less in the same way. But now the Princeps was more than that. And today we don't have time to analyze it, but this event proves something very important. This man is the imperator by definition. It's not like the others. He's the one that has interacted with the sacrum, with the sacred. Hence, he's not like all the others, which is different from a... this is a sacralization, not a deification, even if that will occur post-mortem. That also is relatively less... that's also a big change, but technically the concept of the Imperium entailed it in the sense that the Imperium is divine, and the glorious emperors are to ascend the skies after they die, right? The decursio that in fact also will happen at Augustus' funeral is this old... it's this idea, the typical Indo-European, it's on horseback, all these soldiers basically running around the pyre of the Princeps that is ascending to the skies in his soul. And what do? They throw all their military insignia into the pyre, because they are recognizing at that point that their glory does not belong to them. It belongs to the deity, and it belongs to the chieftain that the Princeps represent. This is Rome was very warlike, very tribal in its essence. Here these guys were recognizing that under Augustus, that was the imperator by definition, all their military exploit had derived from that imperium that was held by the imperator, right, on behalf of the gods. So now that he was, his soul was coming to the skies to sit next to the other, to the divinity, right? That glory was reverted to the skies. It's a beautiful message. It's a beautiful picture, but in this institutional sense, it represents how centralized now power had become compared, to the Republic. Even Caesar had been deified at that point, but it was part of the same struggle, in a sense. After all, the same Octavian had built this temple to Mars Ultor that was erected for, essentially as a promise to crush the Caesar seats, as it basically means Mars the Avenger, referring to the assassination of Caesar, for which Octavian, that was his rightful heir, was to continue the struggle to reunite the res publica. So that had been the concept. And this episode is very, very meaningful, right? Because objectively, the guy, it's pretty also rare this time that, a Roman military commander actually challenges to combat a barbarian chieftain and even wins, right? It's a big deal here. So we can imagine what Licinius Crassus... I don't know the story in detail now. Maybe I will have to check that whether it was true or not. It was maybe just a political move. But, it's possible, because the Romans did maintain this kind of still warrior-like ideal that of the single combat of it was very meaningful, and the empire embodied this principle in itself. So Augustus was doing it now at a higher level, as a political institutional level, and that's what matters here. So also talking about Augustus' military contribution in the years 27, 24 BC, he was occupied harshly with the loyal Agrippa in the settlement of the Gauls and Spain, with the creation of the provinces of the Tarraconensis and Lusitania, right? Roughly, respectively, would be today's central Spain and today's Portugal, right, respectively. But the toughest campaigns were in the north of the Iberian Peninsula, especially the resistance of the Asturians and the Cantabrians was to be crushed once for all only in 19 BC, right? And even Spain will be guarded with 3 legions, as we will see, and actually the Iberian Peninsula as a whole. As you know, the Romans had started fighting in Spain for conquering the peninsula since the 3rd century BC. So only at this point in history, the Iberian Peninsula is completely subjected to Rome, right? The Iberian Peninsula was the Iberian campaigns had been very tough. It had been a bit like Rome's Vietnam, except the Romans won, but at the same time also definitely the Romans consumed many more men and resources than, I don't know, what the Americans did in Vietnam in comparison, and especially these warlike populations of the north of the peninsula were very, very harsh. The Romans at this point had committed tens of legions, even not just in there, but it was tough. And the fact that Augustus went there to preside this the conduct of campaigns together with Agrippa that was doing it is quite meaningful, because it was a very serious affair. And this is a bit of a characteristic of those areas, and in fact will not be very deeply Romanized even later in time. You know, definitely the north of Iberia is one of them. But even the crisis of Roman recruitment chiefly started because of Iberia. There is a big deal of military history attached to that. Even in the 1st century BC, think about Sertorius, all of these rebellions in Spain. The Romans risked to lose it at one point. Overall, in the same time, the Legatus Terentius Varro Murena was subjugating the Salassian rebels of the Val d'Aote, right, with the deduction of the colony Augusta Praetoria between 26 to 25 BC. This would be today's Aosta/Aote in northwestern Italy. It was a very important connection between Central and Southern Europe and the Alps. In 22 BC, Augustus went to Greece and eventually to Asia to manage the East and to settle important matters there, chiefly by increasing the power of his own provincial jurisdiction, because this new the new provinces there were becoming obviously imperial provinces, while he was ceding to the Senate the Gallia Narbonensis and Cyprus. Right. In 20 BC, the king of the Parthians, Phraates IV, pressed by Tiberius, the stepson of Augustus, acquiesced to demand formally the friendship of the Roman people by giving back, by returning the insignia and the prisoners caught to Crassus and Antonius back in the day. We often remember Carrhae, but actually even Antony, when during the second triumvirate had carried out certain campaigns against the Parthians, were not very successful, and the reinstitution of the insignia that were solemnly dedicated to the temple of Mars Ultor was publicized as a Roman success over the Parthians, right? So the idea is that now we got this insignia back, and we show the people of Rome that we kind of subjugated the Parthians too. And in reality, the only tangible results were descent on the Armenian throne of a Philo-Roman candidate, who was Tigranes. Also the creation of the province of Galatia in the center of Anatolia. And at the death of the local client king, that's how it had happened. There were certain peoples, like in this case the Galatians, that didn't quite have a chance against Rome in any way. So Rome had resorted, especially in the east, chiefly to this practice. That is, okay, when there is some kind of political crisis, or one in this case one leader dies, when there is a problem of succession, given that Rome was pressuring from every side, okay, let's just make of this land a Roman territory, and let it be it fundamentally, and that's how the Romans acquired the region, that however maintained its own specificities, historically speaking. Even certain later Christian movements seemingly were influenced by this local Celtic cultural heritage that was peculiar. And so in this context, naturally, also the idea of the revenge, the Mars Ultor that we mentioned before, well, to him were dedicated the eagles that had been lost at Carrhae. So, and it was a meaningful thing. I mean, historically speaking, the Battle of Carrhae objectively was not a big deal. Tactically speaking, it was a disaster, but it's not that Rome missed who knows which opportunities in that sense. It was one moment in which Rome could levy legion after legion without much problems, especially in fact in the 1st century BC. But it had been a very shocking victory, like defeat. I mean, for the Romans, it was a symbol of a major insult that had to be washed in blood. So this idea of the subjugation of the Eastern peoples, that was an Alexandrine model that fundamentally stemmed from the idea that the emperor was so great that it didn't even need to actually fight against a foreign people, but that he would simply surrender in front of the might of this conqueror. And that's how the Romans had dealt with that. And then they, especially in the eastern provinces, they were kind of used to this, because the eastern provinces, after all, were the easiest to control in a way or another. I mean, they were habituated to, with the Hellenistic monarchies, to this fundamental absolutistic form of power, right? So it was not a big deal. It's like the pharaohs in Egypt, the great kings in Persia, right? And this made the Romans pretty happy, because the Romans were open enough, culturally speaking, to be interested even in the marvels of the East, of this kind of exotic culture. So they at this time, many artifacts and monuments even were brought to Rome from Egypt. There were many cults that were adopted in Rome from the area. So this idea of ancient civilizations and their gods that were subjugated by Rome was the greatest glory of of the capital and deities, and the symbolizing the greatness of Rome. That objective at this point was stretching over, from the Atlantic to Mesopotamia, and from the Channel to Nubia now, like no other empire had managed to. So it was a big deal, and it reflected the greatness of Rome in front of the world. But in the East, as we've seen, the reality, especially on the Armenian and Parthian frontier, things were a bit more complicated, right? And of course, the mob didn't know that. There is an interesting branch of Roman history that is essentially confronting, the reality of the governmental propaganda and what, the real reality was out there on the frontier, even archaeologically speaking. When we talk about the Roman army and equipment, we look mainly, think about the early empire, the Trajan column and everything, but when we confront that with archaeology, especially on the frontiers, we realize things were different, right? So we have to be pretty open, even at understanding history without being too dogmatic about certain knowledge that we have, and trying to imagine how certain realities were like. Naturally, the Romans already at this time had identified in the Parthians the major opponents in the East, even though they weren't basically a real threat. Like the Persia would become a real threat only from the 3rd century, essentially. But the Parthians still didn't give up their dream to expand further west, in certain sense, and especially to block what were the Silk Road, the continental branch of the Silk Road. So the Romans always tried to crush the Parthians, and at one point Nero, for example, under Nero that would succeed, but the problem is that you can crash the political unity of those populations, but the point is, how are you going to occupy those territories? Like the Iranian plateau is inaccessible, or at least you can't control, you can't hold it. So this great area of what is known today as the Mashrek, right? So this big kind of mountainous band stretches from Turkey to up into Iran. Like it's pretty tough territory that these great empires very often couldn't practically control. This is true for the Romans. It would be true for the Caliphate, for many other powers. So that just the locals would be fundamentally in charge of what was going on up there. This was a problem for the Romans because they were the stronger ones. They never had enough resources or interest. This was a matter of cost benefits. Now we'll see it better with Germany, to invade those lands permanently, or even succeeding in doing that, right? And this was important for the empire because it was not much of a territorial problem, but as always, remember this: geopolitics does not exist. Literally, geopolitics as a concept doesn't make any sense. You can approximate it in some forms, but it's never about the territory. It's about the political entities in their societies and how they react, and the relations are much more complicated. So the same concept of the empire was based fundamentally on a deterrent, and the Romans, even if you think about it, 150 men plus 150,000 plus per 2, fundamentally with the auxiliary, you have 300,000 men in arms that control a territory that is the one we described before, extensionally speaking. They are actually very few. Let's be honest about this, especially for the time standards and the coercive means of. There are very few. So these were light statal systems, even if we admire them, of course, because the Roman Empire, there was something incredible in its own regard. But they were relatively light systems, and therefore even these further expansions were to be calculated very, very carefully, because resources, even if they were so easily available at one point, still they needed time to be to grow again, right, once they were used. So this was not an easy. It was very delicate systems, socioeconomically speaking. You couldn't squeeze the empires. You could reduce a land even to sterility at one point if you exploit it too much. I mean, it was really a great problem overall to manage an empire of this kind. So drastic resolutions were difficult, and they could be carried out only in face of overwhelming overwhelmingly favorable odds, right? Like, I don't know how easy it had been for the Romans to conquer Gaul, right? It hadn't been that easy, but if you think about that, the Romans conquered it in 8 years, and they maintained it for 500 years, right? So that tells you something, right? In the east, in places like Armenia and Mesopotamia, it was much more complicated, but it would be complicated, as we'll see now, even with Germany, right? In fact, between 16 and but first of all, I wanted to finish by saying something that, in general, in the East, however, the Romans were recognized as protectors, right? By these client states. They were held by sovereigns designated by Rome, right? So this was important because the concept is that Rome didn't enter very hardly into this system. They remained fairly tolerant, and they only progressively absorbed these territories to make them become provinces where the local governments basically failed. That was a problem also because once those lands were acquired, they needed further Roman troops to be garrisoned, and that was further costs, and as long as the local communities could do it by themselves, it was an advantage for Rome to just pay us tributes, fundamentally, just pay taxes, and just let fundamentally our agents operating into the country, right, and everything is fine. So it was always kind of an extortion at the end of the day, but it was done softly enough not to recur to arms. So in 16 and 15 BC, here we have Augustus newly in Gaul to stem a Germanic invasion of Sicambri, actually, Usipetes and Tencteri, right, that had annihilated the legion of the legatus Marcus Lollius, hence the defeat called Lolliana Clades. So, and this had been already kind of a warning bell and for what the Germans were like. But fundamentally, especially these Western Germanic tribes they were a problem in the sense they were trying to push, to raid into Roman territory. But since the time of Caesar, the Germans had understood pretty well who was ruling from the other side, and they had been very careful about that. Now they were trying to be funny again, and and they were spirited, of course, by the defeat of this Roman legion. And while annexating the populations of the Cammonic Valley and the Trompia Valley, and also in the Valtellina, Augustus pushed back the Germanic invaders, ordering at this point the Gallia Comata, that is basically the Transalpine Gaul, excluded the Narbonenses, was kind of difference, into the 3 provinces of Aquitania, Lugdunensis, and Belgica, right? So these would be the major 3 chunks of of let's say not really Atlantic because Lugdunensis is somewhat more continental, but in this area of Transalpine Gaul, non-Mediterranean Gaul, we could say. The years of 1514 BC were instead characterized by systematic campaigns against the Alpine populations. Tiberius and his brother Drusus subjugated Raetia, Vindelicia, the Valles Pennina, Noricum, the Cottian and Maritime Alps. So these were regions that hadn't developed real powers on their own, but they were of very difficult access. They controlled the mountain passes, so the major connections between Gaul and Italy, and therefore controlling those areas was a big deal. The only problem is that fighting against peoples in the mountains is quite tough, right? So even if these are very primitive populations, still they're kind of hostile, and they're difficult to subjugate, right? The full subjugation of those areas would happen roughly under Nero, right? And telling the truth, the Romans even come to terms with them at one point. I mean, they grant them not to fight them, but in exchange for a free passage. And at that point, it was nobody's conveniency to push that for annihilation, right? The Romans in the past had to struggle with similar populations in the Apennines in some areas, and it wasn't easy, right? The Ligurians especially had been a problem, so they knew what they were expecting, and this populations were progressively Romanized. But this tells you, however, how this empire, it makes you feel it territorially speaking. I mean, these are vast spaces. I mean, let's be honest, the Alps are a pretty big chain. There are many valleys. They're tough ground for any army, even today, right? So imagine in the ancient world what this meant. I mean, to have even a population of in the range of thousands and controlling these passes and knowing the territory and having these invaders coming with the technology of the time, you could easily stop them, right? You could halt them. Of course, Rome had the upper hand as a general power, but still, once again, it's a matter of cost benefits ratio at the end of the day. So that's what makes the difference. Also, in 12 BC, Tiberius began the Pannonian campaign, and Drusus the one in Germany, right? So these campaigns are very important because they're basically aimed to secure this Danubian and Rhine frontiers, and to even expand them further, especially in the case of Germany. At this point, the Romans invade Germany, and they will conquer, as we will see now, up to very deep, up to the Elbe River, right? Especially Tiberius, that technically, telling the truth, was a hell of a general. He was one of the best generals of Rome at the time. He subjugated definitively Germany, right? When he took the place of his dead brother in 9 BC, he managed to conquer Germany up to the Elbe River, right, crushing all the populations that he found in the middle. It was a brutal campaign, and yet it was effective. And that proves, by the way, that Romans they did conquer Germany. The point was maintaining it, and in a while we will look at that. And this perspective is important because on the Danubian area, things were even kind of tougher, right? The fact that Germany historically evolved in the thing that it was, and the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest left an important mark into Western history, but sometimes we forget some other populations, including the ones we will see now. In Pannonia, for example, the Romans had to commit tens of imperial legions, right? You think what it means. Those were tough populations that didn't want to succumb. They didn't want to be defeated. They fought to the death. They were extremely bloody campaigns, and in the same in Illyria, as we'll see now, that would cause a mess. And while these campaigns were occurring fundamentally to secure the wealthier, the richer core lands of the empire, right? Regions like Gauls and the kind of even Italy and the Balkanic southern Balkans were important enough to be secured from the invasions of these populations. You know, the Danubian line had been substantially Celticized. Many Celts had arrived up to Asia Minor. We've seen that with the Galatians, and they were quite warlike population. They were fairly primitive in their own regard, in spite of the exposure to kind of more advanced populations. You know, especially in the Balkans, the Greeks had launched these waves of of civilization that even the Dacians had substantially received those influences. They had managed to develop their own kingdom. These other tribes were pretty warlike, pretty unstable. So it was important for Rome, just like in Germany, to secure those areas evenly. The problem is that the Romans didn't quite realize much yet about these areas, especially in Germany. Like, we know that the Pannonian conquest was fundamentally successful, right? Especially the kind of the middle Danube would remain, kind of a depopulated area, a militarized border, not very productive one, but that was the thing. Like, the productive areas had to be in the hinterland. On the Danubian line, just Mysia was agriculturally developed, and that's partly why the reason why the Romans eventually conquered Dacia, aside from the fact it was full of precious metals. But with Germany, you realize that something was going seriously wrong at one point, and that the Romans at this point didn't quite have even, like it was normal at the time, an actual geographical understanding of the situation. Like, the Romans thought that distances were much smaller, and they didn't know these peoples. I mean, no Roman army had ever ventured far across the Rhine. Just Caesar had done that. There had been these other expeditions. Of course, the Romans would know that the peoples who were there. We don't have to think about it like the Romans didn't know what was outside. Of course, they knew that, and they knew it pretty well. And even more, the peoples who were from the other side knew Rome, probably even more. But when you have to conquer one country, you should know a lot of things that even in modern times you realize. I don't know, think about the war in Iraq. Are big problems. Like, they're not easy, right? So think about, with the understanding of the time, with the lack of satellite maps, and the Romans basically didn't even have proper maps. You know, they had the so-called itinerari. Basically, it was just a list of stopping points that were connected. Like, they knew what was the distance between the various others, but they didn't need, actually, because they didn't need a realistic geographical, but it was still adding to the general comprehension, even mostly of the local politics and society, right? The Romans were counting fundamentally on absorbing these populations with the promise of Romanization that chiefly passed through the elites, but it was also a matter of the cooptation of the elites, of the local elites, but also passed through the openness of the local populations to Roman material culture. It was a very important thing. But these peoples were so primitive at one point that they didn't care, right? You can't see it with Caledonia as well. You do think that the Romans actually lacked the manpower to conquer Caledonia. It was not that problem. The problem was that they didn't care to, because if at one point one people just doesn't want to be Romanized, and you will keep revolting, and you have to commit troops, and that doesn't solve the situation, well, you simply build a wall, because that's what literally they did, and that worked, right? So it's meaningful. In the case of Germany, we will see, but it's important which would happen here 20 years later. I mean, effectively, the Romans ruled Germany for 20 years. But at this point, towards 9 BC, the Armenian situation was deteriorating, right? Especially the Philo-Parthians had taken over, backed by the new Parthian king, Phraatakes, excuse me. Who had inspired in here, in fact, an Armenian revolt that would also cost the life to Augustus' grandson, the son of his daughter Livia and Agrippa. His daughter Julia. Livia was his wife, and Agrippa. Right, Gaius Caesar was his name. He was wounded at the siege of Artagira, although he seemingly had a psychological collapse. He died shortly after some month, actually, on the way back to Italy. That was in 4 AD. That was a major blow. It was a tragedy for Augustus, from the empire. I mean, Gaius Caesar was designed to be the heir of Augustus. So this guy, he was 16 at the time, and you can imagine how overloaded with expectations he was. I mean, to be like the future imperator of Rome, he's the main leader. He makes this campaign, he basically fails. He gets discouraged, he's been wounded, but he mostly loses it. Like, we know that he wrote to his grandfather, he told Augustus, like, that he didn't want to appear publicly anymore, that he didn't want this. He was overwhelmed, and he died shortly afterwards. It was a big problem. As we've seen, also Drusus had died. So here, basically, Tiberius was the only one remaining, and in fact, Augustus will eventually even, write this thing, like that he wasn't particularly convinced about Tiberius. They didn't like each other much, to tell the truth, because Augustus was very bright, fascinating. Tiberius was kind of an introverted guy. He was very valorous commander, as we've seen. He had subjugated Germany. We will see, he will in fact fight even against the Marcomanni in the Illyrian revolt. Tiberius is brutally underestimated as a military commander. But at one point, Augustus was forced to recognize him as his own successor, and he wrote it explicitly, like, since we can't do otherwise, right? Because bitterly reflecting on the death of his nephews, because actually even Lucius actually had died. He was another of Julia's sons. He had died too, falling from horseback. He broke his leg, and then he died after some time. Drusus, that I think he liked more, that was Tiberius' brother, as we have seen. I think Augustus liked it more than Tiberius. So the last one out of 4 was Tiberius. That was his stepson, because he married Livia by making her divorce from her current husband, so Tiberius' father. And when she was pregnant of Drusus, and some say in fact that Drusus might have even been Augustus' son, but it's seemingly like controversial. I mean, well, of course we can't know, but in any case, at this point, after the death of Gaius Caesar, the eastern frontier escaped Roman control. Now, in the years 6-8 AD, breaks out this great Dalmatian Pannonian revolt, also called the two Battonians, because the chieftains that led them were called the Bato. This was a major revolt. Like the sources said that Rome didn't commit as many men hadn't committed as many men like in Battonian revolt since the times of the Second Punic War, which is kind of weird because actually during the Civil War many more troops had been deployed, so it may be an exaggeration, but objectively it was important. Like I was reading something recently and basically said that it's not that there was much of an anti-Roman feeling for, I don't know, ethnic reasons or whatever. It's just that, I mean, Roman government, as we've seen before, it was pretty corrupt. And they had exceeded at one point. So this revolt broke out, and it was massive. Like, the Romans had to rush for that, and aborting certain campaigns that were quite important at that point. That is also an indirect cause of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, right? Probably without the Illyrian revolt, there would have not been a Battle of Teutoburg Forest. History of the West might have gone in very different ways, this revolt, now it's complicated. It also lasted very long. But the interesting thing is to look at the Roman perspective in here, because the Romans were about to invade Germany. Or better, we have seen that Germany was already conquered. The problem now were the Marcomanni in Bohemia. Bohemia is this region, roughly today's... in fact, Bohemia, from hence they take the name, Czech Republic. And this region is kind of, if you look at it geographically, it's being a bit on its own, and it's kind of, it has mineral resources. It's kind of important at the time for kind of settlement. In fact, they took the name from the Boii, the Celtic population that originally inhabited that. The Germans basically descended from the north, occupying these lands, but that would be even in part in in today's Germany, for example, southern Germany. Those were Celtic areas, even at that point, because today's Germany comprehends lands like Bavaria, that incidentally takes name from the same boy, seemingly, and that took the name in turn from Bohemian. Like that's the that is today's German, right? They speak German. It's a Germanized land. But at the time it was Celtic, right? And also Central Europe was Celtic. These regions had been Celtic. So the boy now, let's not digress too much, but they had been conquered by these populations that in turn, however, had Celticized a little bit. And the most powerful one was this Marcomannic Confederation. It was pretty militarily strong. They had strong cavalry. They were quite a mobile element, and albeit being German, they were actually enemy with Germany, like with the part of the Romans had conquered, let's say, with this area between the Rhine and the Elbe. And they were the strongest power in Germany at this point. So the Romans actually didn't count the Western Germans much. They thought they were basically a kind of primitive, even relatively and easily controllable people. What they were very worried by were the Marcomanni. Hence, the Romans make this pincer movement that also included the movements of Varus that was coming back, in fact, as we will see now, from the direction of the Marcomanni back to the Rhine, to attack the Marcomanni from the Rhine and the Danube, right? And the toughest army, the toughest Roman army, was commanded by Tiberius, once again, in the Danube. And when the Illyrian revolt breaks out, actually Tiberius has already invaded Bohemia, and he's even winning, right? Because the Romans weren't so gentle, nor so humanitarian, that they knew what they had to do in there, and they were doing fairly well. But when this a revolt breaks out in Illyria, Tiberius has to abort the invasion, and he has even to recognize Marabod, that was the king of the Marcomanni. His possessions is in there. Eventually, well, the Marcomanni will remain a problem, but not maybe such a pressuring one. The major problem they caused was in the from the 60s of the 2nd century AD eventually. So even the Germans had, they had this pretty unstable political groupings. So, but just for telling you how important this revolt was, right? And Tiberius had to, in fact, cross the Danube, going back and starting the subjugation of these Balkanic populations in revolt. And Illyria is here. These regions are roughly today's Croatia, Bosnia. They're tough grounds. Everybody who was fought there knows that pretty well. Hell of terrors like mountains, forests, cold. They're very close to the Mediterranean. Their climate is fundamentally continental, and it lasts very long, right? It's a bath of blood, right? Because the Romans. Because the Romans had begun to absorb those areas since a very long time. Like since the 3rd century BC, they had already set foot in Dalmatia. They had started to look around there, also in the interland, and progressively penetrated. So this is some think that the Illyrians were also in kind of coordination with the Germans at one point for this. And you see also the instability in the east. Never underestimate the underground movements here that, especially in this time, are easier than you expect to organize. Tiberius managed to crush these insurgents, right? And he establishes the 2 provinces of Dalmatia and Pannonia. And it's exactly at this point that there is the Variana Clades, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, so-called. So this Publius Quintilius Varus, you probably know who he was, this governor. He was actually a very efficient governor. He had worked in Syria. He was terrific. The problem, he was probably not an equal military genius, right? And of course, he became the scapegoat of the defeat, because, of course, if you command a Roman leader, if you're in charge of the armed force, you assume your responsibility and whatever. But we can't conceive the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest like a failure of the whole Roman intelligence regarding Germany, right? And it was a big failure all in all. Things could have gone differently, of course. We know today we don't talk about the battle in itself. I will make a video about it. Things might have gone differently on that occasion as well. They trusted the Germanic auxiliaries. They were betrayed by Arminius Hermann, that as an extremely talented leader. His main accomplishment is not much the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in itself as a military event, because also the Germans frankly lost an astonishing amount of troops in that battle. The genius of Arminius stands in the fact that he managed to bring all those Germanic tribes together. I mean, tribes that anyone would have struggled to unite, because the Germans were completely unruly. They didn't care, that they just wanted to fight. They didn't want to be ruled by anyone. They didn't want to be. In fact, Arminius will become a sort of broader Germanic leader, and at one point he will be, knocked out. He was assassinated because the other Germans didn't want anyone ruling over them. So this represented a weakness from their side, because if they had been united, of course they could have accomplished way more. And the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest proves it. As you know, Arminius is a product of one of the best products of Romanization. He had been raised in Rome. He his brother was a extremely loyal Roman centurion that stayed, that had fought for Rome. He even lost one eye, if I'm not wrong. And even after his brother's revolt, he stuck to the Romans and accused him of being. Actually, his brother accused him of being a coward and or a traitor, I don't remember. And then he wanted to challenge him in single combat. It's a very famous scene in Tacitus regarding to this. But as you know, what is important is the consequences of the battle. This battle took place in what would be today's area north of Osnabrück, in this forest, very close, frankly, to a sanctuary that was even used, in fact, because of this, that the mystics that existed in this point, even by the Nazi SS at one point during in the 30s, in the 40s, because of there was a sacred mountain there, a sacred rock that would think about what the pagan mindset was in this time. So even for the Romans, like every place had its own deity, its own sacred. So the battle was a masterpiece from the German side. They managed to bottle the Romans into these narrow paths. The Roman legions were caught up by surprise in this gloomy weather, and this German first. And in 3 days, basically, 3 legions were annihilated. Right, and a very few survivors could tell the story, and the forests were the natural Germanic environment for fighting. Extremely, they knew the territory, were extremely skilled, and it was a true, a victory. Also because the Roman legionary eagles fell into Germanic hands. Now Varus and his headquarters were true Romans, and they decided to fall on their swords before the Germans cut them alive, which was a sensible choice. But it shows, the moral integrity of this man, and after all, he paid his price for the defeat. So it's a very dark story, very very violent. Sometimes we look at these stories like saying, oh well, the battle's kind of cool, like clashing enemy war fighters and things. But think about the darkest, the most violent, the horrifying details of this. There were certain things that were done to Roman prisoners and caught by the Germans and basically transformed into human sacrifices. Sound the worst gory you can't find about these stories here. But it's very fascinating, pivotal event into Western history. It changed probably a lot. It's possible that Germany would have remained under Roman control if the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest had not happened. But not necessarily. It was such a bad thing that eventually the Romans didn't control it, because at this point they realized that probably they had failed to assess what Germany really was, right? I get kind of upset when people compare Gaul and Germany, like saying, oh well, the Romans conquered Gaul, they could do the same thing with Germany, right? They were kind of the same thing. No, they were not at all the same things. The Roman Empire, you see, aside from Germany now, but if you follow all the provinces that it conquered, it basically ruled on certain very specific types of lands, right? Basically, the Romans occupied those lands that could support the Roman model of politics and society and military. Cities, this permanent armored forces, they needed supplies, a certain capability of movement, certain net of roads, and enough agricultural production could support all of these expenses. A material, let's say, a commercial penetration, as we've seen, for spreading material culture, co-opting the local elites. The Germans weren't quite for that. Like, Germany was covered in forests, in swamps, nothing to do with gold, that has this enormous and extremely fertile open plains, the Oppida, this already proto-road system net, the same Romans built upon. Germany is nothing like that. Germany is the third world. And the reason why the Romans invaded is because they think that it's smaller than it actually is, and that they can make it kind of a buffer, like they can establish this Elbe, Carpathians, let's say, border, right? That, telling the truth, they realize it would have increased their problems, because they would have to shift the Roman border to the Elbe. So at their shoulders, these unruly Germans, basically. From the other side, even worse populations, much more military capable, like the Sarmatians, etc. It would have been a disaster, right? So when this massacre occurs, obviously there is a moment of emergency, like, because these 3 legions are wiped out, right? So the Germans are feared to do what they had already done in the previous century, at the beginning of the previous century, actually at the end of 2 centuries before, with the Cimbrian and Cimbrian Teutonists that invaded Italy and other areas of Europe, etc. It doesn't happen, any of that, because also the Germans, recognize what their limits are. But when the things calms down, first of all, the Romans, as you know, will come back there with Germanicus. They will almost fall into another, if not a worse ambush than the one of the Söderberg forest. They managed to recover some eagles, but the whole thing is that they decide to stay out of Germany, and the Romans will keep thinking about it, telling the truth. They will try. They were about to invade it. Marcus Aurelius was about to invade it before he died. Even Maximinus the Thracian actually invaded Germany at one point. So the Romans were always toying with this idea: what do we do with the Germans, right? In Augustan time, the general approach after Battle of Teutoburg Forest was just to contain them, to divide them, and to control them, which was actually a profitable thing to do. The Romans succeeded in that. Varus had thought to treat the Germans as if they were Syrians, right? That is, civilized people. And like with imposing taxes, making judiciary assizes, all these things, the Germanic elites are not interested, and they're completely they're not ready for Romanization. Like, the Germans had literally entered the Iron Age at this time. Just think about it. It is basically primitive populations. They're prehistoric populations. I'm not kidding. They fought with clubs. They were still very. They hadn't reached that level that could cope with the Romans on. And in order to understand what the general benefits of Romanization were, that this would happen only during the migration era, right? But at this time, also thanks to Romanization, it obviously happens because the Germans remain at the borders with Rome. They trade, they interact. Many Germans fight for Rome. Auxiliaries at the same time. Some of them are even settled into Roman territory. There are pretty. Some of the most loyal Roman auxilia would be partly of Germanic origin. Think about the city of Cologne, the Ala Ubiorum, the Ubi, that were extremely proud, as proud to be Germans as much as being Roman citizens, right? That's one of the best and most successful examples of Romanization. But Germany as a whole is not. It can't be dealt with that. The Germans are even a lot, demographically speaking. They're not four-scattered wolves, right? There are many. They're strong demographically. They're warlike. They have a strong, high military quality. Yet they are divided politically speaking. So that's their main problem. And eventually, the Cherusci, after the the Teutoburg force will rise to a position of preeminence of the Germans, and eventually they will fall in a very short while. So the Romans understand pretty well that they can easily continue to have an influence of Germany, to control it indirectly just by nurturing their elites, to Romanize them, to hoping to cope with these peoples and remaining then. And in fact, in Germany, there would always be a pro-Roman faction and an anti-Roman faction, quite simply, and it would go on like that for a long time. And the Germans, in fact, because of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest and migration era, there is this general thinking that they were enemies of the Romans, like a people. Like, it wasn't like that. They didn't probably even conceive themselves as Germans, as like the Roman historiographers called them. Like they were open to the situation. Like, come on, like every other tribe, they didn't have much of a strategic scale of action. They reasoned in very contingently, and that they, in some cases, it was favorable for them to be allies with Rome. In other cases, it was more convenient to fight it. They would usually launch this small, maybe up to medium scale raids into Roman territory, but it wouldn't, like, just during the Batavian revolt they did something like that seriously, but most of the times they, up to the second half of the 2nd century, they weren't much of a threat for the Romans, telling the truth. But the Romans countered them. I mean, the Romans want to show them, however, that there is no way they can do what they had planned to do previously, that was to occupy Gaul, because honestly, the reason why the Romans entered in contact with Germany, and that the Germans first, during the invasion of Gaul under Caesar, where the Germans were about to take over the Gauls, and conquer it, and Caesar defeated them in end of the story. They come back to the Rhine, and they, in spite of these raids, they never think once again to cross again, like en masse, like migrating populations, right? So up to very late in time. So the echo of the Clades, of the Variana Clades, was enormous, right? For psychological reasons, before than real ones. This is the point I would like to stress. From the Roman side, the idea of having lost 3 legions in this order that Augustus had quite carefully set up was a massive problem. The same goes for the death of his nephews, of his grandsons and his stepson, for the failures in Armenia, for this Illyrian revolt. I mean, these were serious problems, right? And they appeared like a bad omen. For example, the 3 legions that were lost in Germany could have been replaced without excessive efforts, right? Because Rome was plenty of demographic and economical resources. I mean, 3 legions more, 3 legions less. There was no cries of recruitment of any sort. They could draw from human resources that in not very far times could have allowed to arm more than double the same number of soldiers. So absolutely, this is pretty even and pretty unknown. But Augustus refused, like he renounced to the idea, because seemingly shocked, as would demonstrate the tradition that wants him to, wander around in mourning, shouting, "Bars, give me back my legion." But more than that, right? That was a shock, and that was a way of even depicting, by a certain type of later historiography, the ambition, the drama of the story. But in spite of of course, the traumatic episode in itself, probably Augustus understood very wisely and very cleverly that it was not worth it. That it was not worth it to waste so many resources to conquer such a hostile and not even very attractive country in terms of natural resources. Like, what would have had Romanization of Germany looked like. The Romans would have had to spend enormous amount of resources to deforest these areas, to bonify them, to build roads and cities, and it would have been very difficult in an environment like that. Who knows, right? But the cost of this enterprise would have resulted as disproportionate for the profits that could be derivable from it. In another crisis, especially like another defeat, for example, could have easily had repercussion on the stability of the entire system at that point, up to that point created, right? So the frontier was definitely fixed on the Rhine, right? Always bearing in mind that the Roman Empire didn't quite have a real border as such. The Roman legions detached on the frontier were really a lot. There were 8, as we will see now. But the idea of the Roman territorial control is not much of the limes that we often talk about. That is a term that seemingly the Romans didn't even use themselves. The Romans used another term which was known as munimentum, which means like a fortification, even though it can't be properly translated. And it's based on the concept that you place a military force in one point and you control the surroundings, which is a realistic understanding what a military force works like, and how a limes is just a conventional line that you trace. Like here, of course, the Rhine was a pretty solid bulwark to stem eventual crossings, etc. The Romans were masters, military engineer, and they could build a bridge over the Rhine in a very few time. The Germans could only dream of that yet, so that was very convenient. But the concept here is more than that. The concept is that with 8 legions stationed on the Rhine, you just don't. It's not because they were stemming the Germans, because that frontier complexively remained fairly peaceful at the end of the day. The idea is that you control both the Germans and Gauls, because remember this, that if the Romans had withdrew their forces from somewhere, local populations would have taken over once again. How do you think an empire works? What were the Romans keeping legions in places like Spain, for example, if there was no bordering enemy? But of course, because if those military forces had not been there, the Iberians, the Celtic Iberians would have taken over once again. And it's normal. It's perfectly normal. It's how all military power, like all powers, control land. Even today, look at what happened, like with recently with all the movements in Syria, in Iraq, etc. That's how it works. If there is a power that withdraws, there is another one that fills in. Normal. So the Romans control the Germans. Like, you can't even say the Germans are theoretically outside of the empire, because the spatial concept doesn't make sense in this sense. The idea of a line into which there is from one side you find an empire, on the other side there is not. It's not how they saw it at the time, right? I can't say it's false in absolute terms. Of course, as we were saying now, even the Rhine was an important barrier, but what about what the Germans did as a political entity, as peoples? Like, they were influenced by the Romans and they behaved accordingly. So for Rome was enough to just check both the Germans and the Gauls, so they would remain fine. In fact, Gaul was a pretty peaceful province. I would point that there would be one revolt, but the Romans crushed it fairly easily. The Germans weren't quite like that, because they had not fallen into the system of Romanization, but they were being indirectly Romanized anyway, and controlled, right? And then, so the legions that had fallen into Teutoburg, so the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, were not reconstituted anymore. Think that in modern Italy, still the number 17 seemingly has this negative stigma. It's considered an unlucky number because of the memory of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. And in fact, the Romans were extremely superstitious, but the Romans were probably one of the most superstitious people in the whole history of mankind. They didn't reconstitute any legion with that number, so they left it. They left this vacuum even in the numeration. And Augustus concluded his strenuous, earthly journey by admonishing his successor Tiberius not to extend the empire further. Not to extend the empire further. Now, this is very fascinating because everywhere you go on the internet or common opinions like, the Romans should have done this, the Romans should have done that, the Romans, they stopped at one point invading other countries, and that's where they failed when they crashed, because they should have invaded everyone. And if you want an advice, is just listen to the words of Augustus. That was a person that understood a little bit more of all of us put together about what was going on at the time. When he said not to extend the empire further. And think of what it means practically, right? Not about the obvious meaning of the phrase, but of what that entails, given his life, given the Roman history, the construction that he had built, right? Here there is a strong preservation in mind. The idea that the empire has to be safe, has to be secure. It doesn't have to exceed, right? The Romans knew pretty well what the concept of measure was about, right? And this was very importantly so, because an empire cannot be infinitely extended, and there are some important limits beyond which things go wrong. And in Germany, they went very, very wrong. And the Romans found out the hard way. But we don't comment on the consequences of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest and such. I mean, the Romans even had a certain innate sympathy toward the Germans, to be honest. During the early empire, the historiography started making of the Germans even since Caesar, technically, kind of a model of the good savage. The idea that these were brute, they were primitive, they were violent, but at least they were courageous. I mean, they still believed into the thing of the warriorhood, let's say, and in the modesty. Like, obviously the Romans were fabricating here the picture they were, but still, that tells us a lot about the Germans, but it tells us a lot about the Romans themselves, which is important to realize at this point in history. So in spite of these problems, the dimensions of the Roman Empire were still freaking amazing. At the death of the princeps Augustus, let's draw what the situation of the provinces was, and mentioning also the relative capital together with it. So, for what concerns the imperial provinces, we talk about Lusitania, with the capital Emerita, today's Merida, right? The Tarraconenses, with the capital Tarraco, today's Tarragona, I believe it's said in Spanish. Aquitania, with Burdigala, today's Bordeaux, in France. The Lugdunensis, Gallia Lugdunensis, with the capital Lugdunum, today's Lyon. The Belgica, the capital Duro Cortorum, today Rheims. Pannonia, with two main centers that are Carnuntum and Aquincum. Carnuntum is today's Petronell Carnuntum. It's a beautiful place, by the way, in Austria. If you ever go there, there is a beautiful archaeological park. It's fantastic. They have reconstructed the old Roman city. There is the arena. There are great reenactors who every once in a while they're convention there with the Austrian the agency for tourism or whatever it is, and they stage this gladiator fights and military parades with the Legionaries. It's so funny. When I went there, I can't post you the pictures of one day. I was there more than 2 years ago, unfortunately, or now. And then Aquincum, that is today's Budapest, the Hungarian capital, and it's very interesting because Aquincum, technically, Budapest is formed by two cities, like Budapest, right? And from the two on the two banks of the Danube, and the Romans had built Aquincum in what is today's Buda, right? From the outer side, from the Barbaricum, let's say, from the Barbaricum side, and in fact that developed over the Roman city as the most important center with Buda, and today the two halves are all together. Then there was the Illyricum, with a capital. At that point, it changed historically. But here we talk just about Augustan times, with Salone, that is today's Split in Croatia. That remained a very important center. There is even Diocletian's palace. You probably know that. It's a beautiful place as well. Then Galatia, I'm pronouncing what would be the Latin of the time for what we know, with the capital Ankara. That is today's Ankara, so the Turkish capital, because yes, Istanbul is the most important city, but Ankara is here the center of that Galatian entity. Byzantium existed as a Greek city at that point, still not being big deal of importance though, and of course Istanbul would evolve from it was named like that by Ataturk, so even the Ottomans kept it calling it Constantinia, right? At the time but it would be Constantinople only from the 4th centuries, and at this time it's not an important place. Then Kilikia, that would be today's like southeastern Turkey and parts of Syria, fundamentally, with Tarsus as a capital. Then Syria, with the capital Antioch. Judea, that in a first time was not actually a province but a prefecture, and the most important city being obviously Jerusalem as the most important urban center in the region. Then Aegyptus, which is the Latin name for Egypt, the capital Alexandria. Then there were the Alpine districts, with that were basically the ones of the Maritime, Cottian, and Graian Alps. They're basically this part of the Western Alps between Italy and France today. Then Raetia, that would be basically today's Switzerland, and Noricum, roughly today's Austria, and actually parts both of Raetia and Noricum, in also the right bank of the Danube into what would be today's Germany, right, up to the Alps down in the south, and these were held by prefects that were waiting to obtain the provincial status, fundamentally. On the Rhine had been established in 10 AD two military territorial districts, let's say, known as Germania Inferior and Germania Superior, right? Here, since they were following, the Romans called them like this, like a bit like today, Lower Germany and Higher Germany, right? So following the Rhine, the inferior, so the lower, is actually the one in the north, right? And the superior is the one in the south. And these areas were presided with 8 legions, as we said before. And other 7 legions instead defended the Danubian border, where Moesia constituted an autonomous military district as well. And Moesia would become a province only under Tiberius. Tiberius was important in these. Also Claudius for the extension of, Britain, Thrace, Mauritania as the new provinces. And so the other legions were garrisoned like this, like 3 in Spain, 4 in Syria, 2 in Egypt, and 1 in Africa, for a total of 25 legions altogether, as we've seen. From these last ones, you can easily understand which major threats were. Like 3 legions in Spain, yeah. Spain is pacified, but still it's better to keep some force in there. 4 in Syria, because that's the Parthian border, right? So you need them. 2 in Egypt, which is fair. I think 1 in the north, 1 in the south, possibly, because Egypt is longer latitudinally speaking. But it's not a big force overall. It's just that the surrounding peoples may get weird and you have to stay ready for that. And just 1 in Africa, which is frankly probably the most easily defendable Roman province, because basically the interland populations are just a bunch of martyrs, so they don't pose much of a threat. So it's mostly for controlling the same local society more than outside enemies as such, but still it's enough to can. Consider that Roman Africa is basically the coast, like the interland is desert, so semi-desertic, and it's not much, right, to fear from. Then there were these other provincials. So given this picture, you realize that the imperial provinces are fundamentally the outer ones of the empire. So they're the ones who have a strictly kind of either military nature or strategic importance whatsoever, for which the emperor holds them in his own control, and together with it all the Roman legions, which is very important. Then there are these senatorial provinces, or better, as we said at the beginning, the provinces of the Roman people. So we're talking about Sicilia, that is Sicily, with the capital Syracusae, which is fundamentally a Greek city. Then Sardinia and Corsica, which are all together, the 2 islands as a single province. These first 2 were the most ancient Roman provinces. They were established after the First Punic War. It's when the Romans basically became an empire, because they start ruling as foreigners outside of Italy, right, over other kind of non-Italic peoples. Then there is the province of, and the capital is Calaris, in the south of Sardinia. And then there is Baetica, that is basically southern Spain, with the capital Cordoba, which is basically one of the wealthiest regions of the empire. It's warm. Certain coastal areas around Malaga, they're kind of subtropical even in character, but it's extremely fertile. It has a lot of mineral resources. It's massively populated in a very intensely Romanized area. Then there is the Narbonensis, with the capital Narbo Martius, today's Narbonne, in southern France. Then there is Macedonia, with the capital Thessalonica. Achaia, that would be fundamentally, today's Peloponnese, Attica, and southern Greece, fundamentally. And with the capital Corinth, right? Corinth had been important part of the Achaean League. I mean, big Hellenistic center. Then Asia, hence the name of Asia. That is actually this stripe of Western Asia Minor, right? The heavily Hellenized one, with the capital Ephesus. Then there is Bithynia et Pontus, so Bithynia and Pontus, with the capital Nicomedia in Bithynia. and then Creta et Kyrene, with the capital Cyrene in today's Libya. And there is Kypros, or Kypros, as the Romans would call, with the capital Paphos, which I assume today is not even a city. I think, or yes, I don't know actually, or I think it's an archaeological site that is different from this. I don't know. Honestly, I would have to check. And then Africa. So roughly today's Tunisia, with the capital Carthage, that had been refounded as a Roman colony by Caesar. After that, as you know, it had been razed to the ground after the Third Punic War. And two administrative ends only, fundamentally, and in order to better and to responsibilize the public services, Italy, the core of the empire at this point, was divided in 11 regions, and Rome in 14 quarters that were called, in Latin as well, regiones, just like the ones in which Italy was split. Now this is interesting because Italy basically comprehended everything from the Alps south in the peninsula. So it basically included what had been formerly been Cisalpine Gaul, right, which is today's northern Italy. At the time wasn't Italy, wasn't considered like such, it was Gaul, right? While Italy basically was from Gaul south up to the Strait of Messina, and Sicily was not part of Italy. And it was subdivided in these regions, and that tells you, that's important because it's a testament of how the Romans managed to Romanize the Po Valley and the local populations. And in fact, Cisalpine Gaul was very important at this point for the military balance of the empire, because especially during the civil wars, it had been the true center of Roman military power. Like, if you controlled Cisalpine Gaul, you basically controlled the whole west, and it was a highly militarized area and colonized by the Romans. Alright, today we talked about a lot of things, and I wish I had talked more, telling the truth, because there would be a lot of things to talk about. But this was our space of Roman history today, and hopefully we will talk about many other stuff on another occasion. As you understand, in conclusion, it's a very interesting picture. We just outlined it. We tried to make it a bit more critical than anything, just the sheer data, but it's important to reflect, and especially in this last differentiation between the senatorial and imperial provinces, right? There's a very important differentiation that reflects the two spheres of competence, right? To the emperor goes the military, so the power in the empire de facto, and this direct control of the state on the borders, right? In the core land of the empire, right, in the Mediterranean, the wealthiest, the richest, the most populous, those go to the senators that can do whatever they want in there, basically. Obviously, well, of course, with a degree of, reason. Roman government was fairly good for the time, in spite of corruption and everything. That was a normal standard you have to take into account in every other place in the world at that point, in the same measure, basically. But Rome was flourishing, as we know. These were the moments of the the Augustan Roman Empire was not all this. It was a more prosperous time for the empire than for the people themselves, right? Things would change a little bit afterwards. As we were saying, the apex of Roman quality of life would be under the Antonines, and but that's also when certain problems start and things start to go down a bit, but we will talk about that on another occasion. also reflect on the figure of Augustus and the system that he had put in place. Together with, today we didn't look much at the general institutional political reforms of the Principatus, but we will do it on another occasion. Today we will look mostly at this territorial organization that is very important, also from the military point of view, but it already displays this very, self-evidently, these characteristics in terms of the development of princely power and what would be in fact the monarchical direction of the empire that will intensify the more times will, the generations will go on. It was fairly rapid if you think about it, but that's what makes it more interesting, and we'll see it another time. So finally, for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.